All right. So thank you all. What I want to do with today is try to share with you as much information as possible, but to let you know that a lot of folks have shared they read a lot of the sources I sent. So I'm probably not going to discover anything new, but maybe I can help answer questions, put a little meat on the flesh of some of the things that we've learned. And what I want to do is kind of break this down into a number of things. One, things that remain the same, and things that have changed in terms of General Conference. There's a little bit to share from Annual Conference as well, which is one of the reasons I wanted to wait afterwards, that I wanted to share with you that is in relation to what we're doing, but also just a couple other things from Annual Conference that you would want to know or might need to know about or have questions about. Anything I can't answer, I will. Anything I can't answer, I'll try to get back with you as much as I can, but I feel like I have a pretty good grasp of some of the changes that are in front of us. So with that, I know we just worship, but I want to pray and ask God to be part of this no less than anything else that we do. God, we lift up this time to you in a way that is sacred and that is aware of your holy presence. So guide the meditation of our hearts and the words of our mouths in a way that you, God, are able to speak and that we are able to seek understanding, to have faith, and where there is no understanding, trust that you continue to walk with us. I give you thanks for your church. I give you thanks that we, God, get to be proclaimers. We get to be life changers, and in a way that you have changed us, and so that your grace and mercy might work. As always, God, keep our eye on the prize, and that is of your kingdom, both here and the kingdom that is to come. In this name of Christ that we pray, and all God's people said, amen. Okay, again, I'm going to do everything I can to get us out of here by noon, but I'm not going to rush through. I do want to pause every so often to stop, see if there's any questions. And as always, Paul, if you can't hear me, tell me to speak slower or into the mic so that you can hear me well. But want to give you just some brief reminders about some of the things we've actually tried to talk about in Wednesday night gatherings about what General Conference is, how it functions, how it works, and based on some of the questions that I've received as well. As you likely are aware, General Conference is the body in the church and the only body that can change our book of discipline, which is our guiding law of the church, you might say, but also the resolutions and social principles, of which are not law, but are part of our theological task. And that work has been completed this year. Just as a reminder, there were 775 delegates that attended General Conference from all over the world this year. There were over 1,000 different legislative petitions submitted ahead of that General Conference. One of the questions I have, and one of the things you might have heard during there, of something called a consent calendar or consent work. One of the ways that things are decided at General Conference before being voted on in what are the main plenary sessions that you see streamed online are in committees. And so when you heard consent work being done, which is related to some of the things we'll talk about, that's what that's talking about. A lot of the work happens in those committee meetings before it comes to the plenary floor, simply because you have to do that. You never get through 1,000 petitions in a week's time if you don't lump things together. So that's what that's about. That's not an intent to try to hide things or keep things away. It's just it's good function. It's the only way the body can function there. And so committees came to a lot of consent on some of the things that passed, and they were lumped into those votes. Usually, these are rather perfunctory, the way they're done. But anyone who wants to call for discussion, amend these things, can pull those off, and they can be addressed on the plenary floor. Sometimes that did happen, sometimes that did not happen. And on one of the larger votes, it didn't happen. It happened in committee, and it was approved on plenary, and is related to some of the language around sexuality that we'll talk about tonight. And so that's one of the things I was asked. I wanted to kind of walk through that process with you just briefly. Legislation and resolutions that were adopted, they will change our current discipline, and those changes will not take effect until January of 2025. So in other words, all the changes to our book of discipline will be published between now and January. So you don't have a book of discipline right now that reflects General Conference. That is forthcoming. Does that make sense? Any questions about that stuff? Didn't want to spend a lot of time. I want to kind of prime the pump with that. Okay, is that clear enough, I hope? Okay. Another quick thing for you all to understand is jurisdictional conference begins this week. Begins on the 10th of July, ends on the 12th, and that's at Lake Juneau, Alaska Conference Center in North Carolina. the jurisdictional conference, as you saw in my notes, this is the body of the church that has the responsibility of promoting and supporting United Methodist Church in the southeastern jurisdiction, which we're a part of. Other jurisdictions will meet, but the southeast jurisdiction, which represents us, will be meeting this week from the 10th to the 12th. Currently, one item that will come out of that for us, or we've been told will come out of this, but it may not be guaranteed, is that the plans are in place for the Kentucky and the Holston Conference to share the same bishop. So it seems out of that work, that could be a possibility that the Holston and the Kentucky Conference would be together, we would share one bishop. We've kind of done that before when our bishop served North Carolina, as you recall. Part of this is due to the need of fewer bishops this year. And I don't think they're going to elect any new ones, but please don't hold me to that. But that information is online to follow as well, and that source was sent to you via my email the last couple of times. Wanted to first talk about some of the changes that happened at the annual conference this year. Anita and I, is Anita here? I saw her, yeah, Anita's here. Anita and I were your representatives to annual conference this year. And so we felt important to share some of the details from that. One quick one, Winter Blitz, Tim, so you to know, will take place here in Bowling Green next year. On January 24th at 25th and Broadway, so it could be that maybe we can help that happen. That's one of the largest youth gatherings in Kentucky, so that's going to take place here in Bowling Green this year. That was the first day, key business. The second day, there was a lot of conversation about exit options. As you recall, back prior to General Conference, we have what's called disaffiliation. Disaffiliation ended. And so one of the responses from annual conference this year was a conversation about exit options for churches unhappy with the revised policy. Because that disaffiliation had ended and general conference did not extend it, conversations about these churches took place on that Tuesday. A motion was brought forth based on paragraph 2549, but it was ruled out because it continued the language of 2553. What I mean by that, the motion that came to annual conference was essentially disaffiliation, and that was out of order because that has passed now and is no longer a possibility. The trustees reported that day they examined in that, but there was no decision based on that. And so that motion was called out of order on Tuesday. On the next day, a motion for our trustees to work on a faith and just pathway was brought back to the floor, and that was not rolled out of order, and it did pass 227 to 205. So it was a pretty close vote. Now, what does that mean? I can't answer that in fullness yet, but I want to read this to you. The motion was given to encourage the Bishop and Cabinet of Kentucky Annual Conference to explore the Book of Discipline, paragraph 2549, as a potential means for facilitating a fair and just pathway for churches to exit the United Methodist Church. Now, 2549 means nothing to you all. I understand that. Didn't mean not much to me either, except that that is a paragraph about closing churches. But it's based on ministries not happening at the local church, too few members, lacking leadership, and we use this paragraph every year to close churches that have met this criteria. It's one of the last things we do at annual conference. So because that passes, where are we at then? Well, we're not sure because the second motion that came right after that was that we need a jurisdictional ruling on this it's possible to do. So it's very possible that we can't do this, that the bishop nor the trustees nor cabinet can do that. So there's a jurisdictional question about whether or not that can be utilized. Let me make clear that this was encouraging cabinet and bishop to explore the Book of Discipline as a potential means. Nothing has been decided. That is not an option for us today. That was a request for the bishop and the cabinet and the trustees to look at that. Secondly, it was a question about whether or not that's even possible to do. So I want to pause there. Does that, as I watched that, I had to keep up with things. So I'm trying to be as clear as possible about that. Anita, would you add anything to that? Or what questions would you have? Yes, Paul?
The separation.
Mm-hmm. Disaffiliation.
Disaffiliation. Why was that brought up before the end of conference?
Before general conference?
Yes, because what I'm saying is people were asked to make a decision.
Before the decision was made, yes.
Before the decision was made.
All I can do is acknowledge that's exactly right. The reason that happened that way was because of the canceled general conferences. Okay, that's the reason it happened. I'm going to get back to that in just a moment, but that's why that disaffiliation mark was in place, assuming that a general conference would happen. That did not happen. It was canceled due to COVID, and that deadline did not move forward. And at this general conference, they did not forward that deadline either. So disaffiliation is now gone. It is not a possibility. Hence, you have this that was brought to the floor on our annual conference. I've got one more note about that I'll say in response to other conferences as well, but that's how that came to be. Is that confusing? Yeah, it is. The timeline was out of order, and it made it very confusing, right? Yes, absolutely. I agree with you. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
What percentage of churches did disaffiliate?
I have seen. I'm going to say around 40%, but I don't think it's totally clear yet, to be honest with you. I think total churches and number of members is two very different things, and I don't think that's quite clear. Let's just say about half, but that's a guesstimation on my part if it gives you a feel for that. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have a better answer for that, but I don't think it's easy to find that. Yeah.
Does this mean that if this, I don't understand why this church hasn't taken a vote or who votes to whether or not we accept the new.
In terms of disaffiliation, our main council chose not to take a vote last year. When was that date?
Voted on this.
That we did not take a church vote. Yeah, we did not take a church vote. Yeah.
And you voted not to disaffiliate.
We have voted not to do anything because general conference had not happened, and we wanted to see what would come from that so we might respond to that. And I'm going to go back to this motion in your conference is in response to that very question, because your very question was churches said, well, we wanted to wait to see what happened, and now what? And so that is why that motion was brought to the floor, and why I wanted to share it with you today. Yeah. I will say that motion, that paragraph, not every annual conference has treated the same. I know in our annual conference it was welcomed as a legislative piece, and I think it was Virginia, that bishop called it out of order. Essentially what that is a paragraph that's not intended to help churches leave for this reason. What they're asking for, is it possible we could use it for that? That's where that is. And we're at a stage of one, is it possible? And we need to find out if that's even something we can do. So that's why I'm saying there's not anything to do with that now. That has been put forth for us. And that is why I share that there. Okay?
Do they realize this stinks of bad faith?
I'm sorry?
Do they realize that this stinks of bad faith? When you sit there and you go, well, you need to make a decision before you know what the decision is about. Well, we can't do that.
Yeah.
We didn't have the conferences. Well, too bad, folks.
Yeah.
We're going to do what we want.
I hear that, and that is exactly what we heard at annual conference this year. Is that fair, Anita, when you say? Yeah. That's where this came from. That's where that petition came from. Is there any way to use this paragraph for churches who may not want to stay because of that? And I can't tell you whether or not that's going to pass or not. So, yes, I understand that.
Well, it's going to be decided by the same people who decided the other, correct? So I think we pretty much know what's going to happen.
Yeah. By the same people, yeah, maybe, I guess so. I don't understand that completely, but I'm going to.
Somebody decided not to extend the disaffiliation program.
I got you. Yeah, General Conference decided not to do that. Yeah. Yeah.
On this other.
Yeah. I will say, and I'll get back to that in just a moment, I think one of the olive branches that came from that was, I'll come to that in a moment. Can I put a pin in that? Because I think one of the things that came out of General Conference. I understand that. I hear that. Yeah, I hear that. But there's a response to that came out of General Conference I do want to address when we get to it here in just a moment. So I'm going to come back to that conversation in just a moment. Is that okay? Okay. All right. In other words, we're going to come back to that. So I'm just going to put a pin in that just for a second. Another thing that came through annual conference that we both felt we need to share was our budget passed this year at annual conference. And it's going to pass with an $80,000 deficit. One of the key things that happened in our conference this year was annually funding for campus ministries, of which you have about 20, has been decreased over the last 15 to 20 years. And this year slated to decrease again to the tune of $80,000. Yet when it got to the conference floor this year, after a number of debates, the body voted to put that amount back into the budget, which meant for that $80,000 deficit. And the CFA, which is our financial branch of the Kentucky Conference, will need to find a way to balance our budget this year. So I just thought that was important to share because we do try to support campus ministries. That is another part of the work that we did this year. And looking forward to next year, the 2025 missional offering is going to benefit campus ministries. This year, that was about $14,000. And we have around those 20 campuses. So hopefully that'll be more next year. But I just want to share that detail with you in terms of annual conference as well. Any questions about that? Okay. I want to look at a few things for general conference. And Rick, this one I'm going to get back to your question because it's not just what happened at annual conference, it's also general conference realities. Things that happened and things that didn't happen, because that's that area of that question that you're asking about lives in for me. I want to talk about things that didn't change. And I heard a lot of this before general conference came. A lot of questions about whether or not we were changing our doctrine, our basic beliefs in Jesus' incarnation, the resurrection, and the return of Jesus. There are a lot of things going in a conference. Question about that is if we're changing that. No, that didn't change. And it wasn't, and we shared beforehand it wasn't going to change, and it didn't change. So that remains the same for us. Our beliefs, our basic core beliefs have not changed. We still believe the scriptures are the revealed word of God and contain all things necessary for salvation, as John Wesley put it. It was interesting to have to say that, but at the same time, there's a lot of information that's been passed around. Some of it, frankly, is not helpful and not true. And that's one of those things that wasn't true, and it's still not true, and those things did not change at this conference this year. Another thing that didn't change, local churches, through the trustees and in dialogue administrative teams, will still decide what types of services and gatherings take place on their property. That was the case before, and it remains to be the case here as a church now, and that's significant to some of the things that have happened as well for us. In other words, our trustees can say how we use this building. That remains the same for us. So that's not new. You'll hear me talk about that, but that's not new. That's the way it has been. Pastors will also continue to decide who they will and will not marry. I've always been able to say yes or no to weddings. Thankfully, as I shared my sermon today, a Methodist pastor said yes to mine, but I could say he could have said no to that, and that would have been just fine. So that part doesn't change for us either. So now things that do change. Regionalization is something we talked a lot about. The ability to have 4 area conferences did pass: Africa, Europe, Philippines, and the U.S. Can make decisions on some parts of the Book of Discipline for local context. It passed, but it's still not approved because it takes a 60% aggregate vote by annual conference. In other words, regionalization has passed, yet it won't be until next year if it truly passes, because 60% of all Methodist churches have to approve that change. And so those votes are going to take place next year. And if it does pass, and I would anticipate it passing, there are a few things, a few outcomes from that we'll want to talk about. But one of those key things is going to be changing the Book of Discipline based on your own context. That's one of those intersections as it comes to this issue of sexuality. Who doesn't get married? Could it be down the road that disciplines will change? Possibly, but it won't be until after next year that takes effect, and then we know the details of regionalization. But that did pass. This will also mean that sets the standards and character. Excuse me. Get my notes out of the way here. I don't want to do that. Okay. So that'll take place next year. Any question about regionalization? I don't have a lot of information to share with you other than it did pass, and we still have to vote on that, and next year we'll start seeing details in regards to that. But the biggest part of that is going to be the disciplines will be changeable in some areas based on which region that you live in. Yes, Nancy?
So we would have our own discipline, a regional discipline.
Our region would have a book of discipline. The discipline as we have it now would be our discipline. But those regions will be able to change that discipline in some areas going forward. That's what the immediate reality of that. Yeah. Nothing yet, but that's possible going down the road. Okay. Any other? Yeah.
Are you saying that this conference or this region can keep what we've had before, go to, and somewhere in California can change it to?
No, it does not mean that. It means we will have a book of discipline in the United States.
Oh, okay. It's not the Kentucky region, it's the United States.
Exactly right. Good question, though.
And the United States
Is its own region.
can vote to keep it the way it was.
Africa and Europe and the Philippines could change the discipline. In some, I say some areas because you can't just change any of it. In some places, they can change their discipline.
Has it not been changed?
This, yes, it has been changed.
And all the votes have been in and so on and
Yes.
so forth, we don't wait till next year?
And January 2025 is when those take effect. Yeah, yeah. Good question. Other questions? Okay. The social principles. Our social principles, as we talked about, our book of discipline is our church law. These are the ways for which we will conduct business as a church. This is how we appoint pastors. It's how we set boundaries. It's how we establish who district superintendents are, who can or can't use the buildings for which we serve in. That's part of the book of discipline. The revised social principles also changed this year. Now, these represent the church's theological task of looking to Scripture to address the needs of the world. Social principles are a statement on social issues that call us to action, but they're not church law, and they do not require agreement. So our social principles are a way we look at various issues in the world, such as sexuality, as we've talked in terms of abortion, war in the world, poverty. If you're here for those 2 or 3 sessions, all the issues in the world, our social principles are our theological work of here's how we understand God to be at work in this. Yet that does not require agreement on our part for those things. We don't have to live by these, in other words. These are the way for which we look at the way the world is the way the world is, and how the church is called to speak into that. But here are some key changes that you're aware of or want to make you aware of. Language about homosexuality was taken out. The Book of Discipline from 1972 to 1924, or 2024, said that homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teachings. Prior to 1972, there was no statement. The social principles around marriage now state within the church, we affirm marriage as a sacred lifelong covenant that brings 2 people, adult man and woman of consenting age, or 2 adult persons of consenting age, into union with one another. And remove the statement that the practice of homosexuality is compatible with Christian teachings from the social principle as well. Those are the changes to the social principles that we have this year. Any questions about that? There are some questions related to that later on that I want to come back to that folks ask about the social principles. But any questions that you have about this part of the changes this year? Yes?
So we reaffirm the scripture.
Mm-hmm.
Does the scripture address same-sex marriage?
Same-sex marriage? No. But we vary on how we see that it addresses homosexuality. We don't agree on that. There are parts of the scripture for which folks would say, for a man, it should be between a man and a woman. There are those who read that differently. Would not deny that it's there, but there is the division that we have. I will say that this is one of the things, this is the only part that was pulled on the floor. That section where it says adult man, 2 persons of consenting age, was amended to also include adult man and woman of consenting age as well. So you see in that statement the tension that we have in the church. We have those who believe that the Bible is clear, and we have those who do not think the Bible is clear about homosexual marriage. Yeah. Any other questions about that? Any follow-up with that? Okay. Okay.
The precedent, you say that this is what the church believes we should do, but we don't have it.
Our social principles,
Yeah. I mean, all of them in general.
they're not church, well,
For what purpose?
what,
I mean, this
Yeah.
the church thinks
Let me give you an example. One of the things we talked about in our last Wednesday night gathering was on the issue of capital punishment. That our social principles say as Methodist churches, we oppose capital punishment. However, I am quite sure that we have members in the Methodist Church who do not oppose capital punishment. It is not required as a pastor for me to be for capital punishment or to be against it. But as a body that voted on that body felt like that we want to say that we're against capital punishment. And by us, by me, the General Conference body votes on that and works towards that. That's what I mean by it not being church law. Church law would be, as we've had it before, and that's removed, if you were, I'm trying to think of the language, practicing homosexuals could not be ordained. That was church law, and we were called to abide by that. Social principles don't work that way. I hope I'm explaining that okay, but the two are delineated in that way.
But we go to the world saying these social principles do not be as United Methodist believe.
To the best of our ability, this is what we believe today, yes.
At the same time, I don't have to believe like you're saying, capital punishment.
We're going to agree that we're going to agree that we're not going to agree on that. Another, I think, a good one that Larry brought up there, and I'm trying to use other examples to help explain this. And I didn't know this, that we are against the draft as a church, because we think we don't think it is, as I say we, our book of discipline says it does not equally distribute those who we call in the military service. However, we recognize in that same verse that there are seasons for which the nation feels like it has to do that. And so we acknowledge the tension there, but we don't force anyone to agree or disagree on the matter. We're doing our best to say, here's what's happening in the world, here's what we feel God is doing, and so we want to make this statement into that. That's how those two things are delineated. Hopefully that helps. At times, absolutely. I don't agree with everything in the social principles personally. Yet I'm not required to. If a candidate came before the Board of Ordained Ministries to be ordained and they want to speak to an issue of the world, I would ask them to think it through theologically. And I want to know that their theological response to that is sound. But if they came up with an outcome that I was different from, I would not hold that against a candidate. It's a matter of, are you doing your theological task responsibly? Are you looking at the scriptures in a way that your view on this is founded? So is there dissonance in that? I think that's the word you use. Sometimes there is. And that's part of the Wesleys. We agree to disagree on matters that are not key or central. But on some things we will not disagree on, back into our doctrine and our core faith. These are things that we do all agree on. For that, we do hold to be firm. But not all things do we put in that category. So yes, sometimes we do differ on how we come to the conclusion of those matters. And the Book of Discipline represents that, and the social principles reflect that. If you'll go back through and read that, you'll see we stand against this, but we also realize this is part of it. I think our stance on abortion is clear as well. It struggles with it. You can see it there. Any other questions? Remove a restrictive language is another thing that did change. UMC clergy and churches are not prohibited from or required to perform or host same-sex weddings. As I mentioned earlier, we've never had to perform weddings that we don't want to do, but before we were prohibited from doing same-sex weddings in the church. That prohibition has been removed. Clergy are no longer required, are no longer compelled, nor are they prohibited from doing same-sex unions. That said, and this I want to get back to a question I think it was Rick mentioned earlier, one of the things that did come out of General Conference was, in place of disaffiliation, was saying that churches could choose whether or not they would allow same-gender weddings in their churches. And so for that is the only decision on this matter that we as a church have been given to make as a church. Our trustees and admin council are going to be meeting this week to begin that conversation together. They've not had that conversation together yet, but that is a decision that the trustees, along with the admin council, can make across the board. We're not required to make any changes. We can if we want to. But our admin team and our trustees are going to begin to have that dialogue this week, this Tuesday, to have that conversation. And I want to share, I have not been asked, and I have not have any same-gender weddings scheduled, and I would never do that before our leadership in the church had an opportunity to discern these decisions. It is going to be up to this church to decide whether or not we would have those same-gender weddings in the walls of this church. Now, having said that, whoever I am, whoever sits in this position, that doesn't mean a clergy person could not do that wedding outside the walls of this church. Whether that be me or someone else that comes, that is going to be up to the decision of whoever sits in my position as your pastor. I'm trying to wait to see where we as in the church fall in this, because I want this church to be able to make its faithful decision on the matter. Related to this, one of the questions that does come up is, will we be appointed a gay pastor? Or, and that is, could we be? Possibly, but that would always come through discernment of the cabinet and the bishop and your staff parish relations team. And they weigh those things. If there's a congregation for which a pastor, it's obvious they're not going to be able to serve well in our conference, you're not going to be appointed there. So no one would be forced to do it, but it would be a dialogue with our staff parish relations whether or not we would ever take a gay clergy person in our conference. So I want to add that clarity as well. Pause there. Any questions that brings for us? Yes?
So the church has the right to request not to have a gay pastor?
They can have a policy. No, we don't have a policy for that. That would be in relationship with the district superintendent and the bishop. And that would be part of that conversation. The bishop has made it clear a number of times. First of all, we don't have that scenario right now.
Right.
And I'm going to be your pastor for another year. And so it's going to be in consultation as it always is. But there's no restrictions that came out of General Conference. The only restriction came through churches can decide whether or not they will have same-gender weddings in the church. Okay. Good question, though. Yeah.
Is that voted on every year, whether we have, or is that something that just comes up and sporadic?
Our policy can change any time. I mean, we just did a lot of work on a wedding policy this year, and so it changes quite often. So that's not set in stone. It can change, yes. Yeah, but there's no set time for that. That's up to the wisdom of the body. Does that make sense to our trustees, or Joe agree with that? Admin council
Is
folks?
that a full church vote, or is that a charge non-conforming vote, or is it just?
That would come through. That is a decision of the trustees in relationship with admin council. As it stands, that's not a church-wide vote. That is a trustees, admin council decision. But it's also highly relational and dialogue as well. Does that make sense? Would anyone add to that? Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Say it again to clarify, please. When you say the words churches can decide,
Mm-hmm.
I'm hearing churches can decide, and it means different things about different topics. Can you just clarify again as to whether there could be a gay pastor and whether there could be marriages within our church? It sounded like two different.
Yeah, I hear that. Believe me, I know. Yeah, I'm with you. If it feels like splitting hairs sometimes, it's exactly what it feels like sometimes. It's a lot. So forgive me if I didn't do that well. I'm going to try to be clear about that.
I apologize. I think the other backup question kind of came up too is just, does churches can decide ever mean a church-wide vote?
Yeah.
Like any of those topics?
Church-wide votes would have been disaffiliation. Anything relates to, last time we did here was during the capital campaign, y'all recall that, before I got here. That would be a church-wide vote because it pertains to the physical building itself. Disaffiliation would have required a church-wide vote. This is not one of those things. This doesn't require a church-wide vote. Should we be getting feedback from our members? I would say so. But that would not be a church-wide vote. So no, not in this instance. The discipline says the trustees can establish wedding policies that prohibit same-sex weddings in their churches. That is the decision that, when I say churches, It is through our trustees that we can make that decision. In terms of, is that helpful there? Is that clear? Okay. So the second question you asked had to do with appointments. That comes through the relationship of your bishop, your DS, which is part of the cabinet, and your staff parish committee. In other words, hey, we have a pastor. What would this be like for you all? We'd be able to voice that as a staff parish committee. Could we force that? I'm sure, but I've never been forced to go to a church. I don't think the cabinet ever works that way. It's in relationship is the way that would take place. But there's no, guarantee. There's no policy that we can set that says we would never have that as a church. Is that helpful? Okay, thank you for being patient with me. Yep.
If we don't get a vote as a church,
Mm-hmm.
can we at least get a list of who's on all these committees so we can talk to them?
I think that's something our admin council wants to hear tonight. Yeah, absolutely. We want to hear from our church members on that. I don't want to get ahead of admin council. I've tried my best not to do that, and so don't hear me hesitating there of not being. I'm leading, but I'm trying to trust my leadership in the process as well. I can't imagine they're not going to hear from you all about any decision that we make. Would that be an official church-wide vote? That's not in order here. That's not what this would ask for. However, I know, talking to our leaders, that we have a deep desire to know the heart of our church. And if anyone wants to speak to that, please do, but that's kind of where, that's what I'm hearing, and I think I can say that with a lot of confidence. Thank you for that question, though. That's an important one. It's not, yes, Emily?
I think it just might be helpful for those who are either not serving on one of these
Mhm.
committees or in the process of either later leadership or trustees or kind of how those are selected.
Mhm.
Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
I think that might clarify.
And I think I'll send, and it's on Realm, and I do send it out there after every general conference. There's usually copies left for a while, but I'll be sure that's out there for you all as well to see who serves on these committees. I'll say that too, because that was your second person to ask me for that. I serve on I chair one committee in the church, and I chair what's called our Leadership and Nominations Committee. But it's not that I make all the decisions. There's a body that comes together. We nominate people to serve different leadership roles in our church every year, and that work begins this month, actually, because, believe it or not, charge conferences are coming up this fall. And so those terms are, for some committees, not all committees, you serve 4 years, 3 year, excuse me. For some committees like trustees, staff parish committee, I'm forgetting something, nominations, you can serve a 3-year period. You can serve 2 consecutives in a row, but not more than 2 in a row. Finance committee is put together by those who serve in various roles. So that's not one that graduates off. All others, you're on for a lifetime. Not really, but but that's how that works. So but even though we nominate, it is at your charge conference this fall for which we get to vote on that, and we would approve that as a body, as a church. So is that helpful? Yeah, yeah.
It might also be helpful to let everybody know who's on the nominations
Mhm.
committee.
Sure.
In case,
Yep.
like, when we vote, 'cause
Mhm.
I'm on that committee. So if anybody wants to be on that committee.
If you ask, we will listen to that one. Yeah, yeah.
Then call those of us who nominate
Mhm.
people to get on those committees.
Mhm.
Because most of the time, we look over the list of membership and say, you call this person,
Yep.
you call this person, you call this person. And hopefully, people will say
Yep.
yes. So we don't know who might really want to be on these committees. So that would be helpful as well.
Yeah, but I'm going to resend that document to you this week so that you can see who serves in all the different roles that we have here at the church. Because the second person asked it. Ron?
Greg, I think we need to make sure everybody understands that this process hasn't moved very far in this church yet, so you haven't been left out.
Yes, thank you.
When we learned that the trustees were ultimately going to be the group that would make the decision of whether or not gay marriages took place in this church, in this facility, Jim and I suggested to Craig that the administrative council have a meeting with the trustees, not that we didn't not trust the trustees, but to broaden the conversation so that the trustees, the small group that they are, didn't feel so obligated to have to make that decision on behalf of the entire church.
Mhm.
So it was our suggestion that this meeting on Tuesday take place so that the trustees could begin to hear a broader group of people giving them their thoughts and ideas. So we need to hear your thoughts and ideas
Mhm.
as the administrative team so that we can help convey that, and there are members of the trustees sitting here listening to this too, but so that we can have that conversation. So I've been concerned that some folks in the church felt like this process was moving very fast and we've been left out. Nobody's been left out. The decisions have been made. I do think, and maybe this is my prior career, I do think you need to have policies and procedures to protect our staff. Because the question is going to come up, are we going to have gay marriages at State Street United Methodist Church? And, you know, somebody said maybe we didn't need to have a policy. Well, I don't think that's fair to the staff. I think we will need
Need to be clear.
a decision at some point, and be very clear about what we want to have happen. So that's where we are.
Yep.
Are we gonna have any church-wide votes on any of this? Do the normal people like to do that? So why not?
But I think what he's trying to convey, we want,
You chose not to even vote on disaffiliation, right? Without,
When that process was open for disaffiliation, there was a process where
Mhm.
I think it was two people had to come forward and ask for a vote.
not me.
No one came forward and asked for a vote.
There's also a several month long search process where
Yep.
multiple people from multiple perspectives of the church.
Yep. Yep.
So again, no one got left out of that. It's just that.
It hasn't happened yet.
It just didn't.
And I had asked that we wait until after annual conference because some of the things, like the petition that came at annual conference, I don't want us to make a decision and then turn around and do something different. Wanted to wait for annual conference to be through so we could get that. But you're right, we have not made decisions. Part of the reason we're having today to say we're going to have that conversation, and I feel very confident there's going to be a way for the admin team and trustees to hear from our church members. Is that a church vote? No, that does not. It does not a church vote. Doesn't call for that. That would be out of order. However, as you're hearing, folks do want to hear from you, and I think they're going to make a means for that to happen.
So could you just speak to, is it just an informal, how do we want the congregation to let admin council know how they feel? Are we saying we're just having informal conversations? Can you speak to that process?
I think that's what we need to talk about Tuesday night in part, is how do we hear from our church? We need to decide as a body, how do we need to hear from our church so that we feel like we know the heart of this church here? That's the decision admin team and trustees together, I think, can make. It would come out of that meeting, how we go about that. I don't think it's just, let's go talk to a few people. How do we go about getting that information from our church? I think that's part of the work we have to do. Is that fair to say, Jim and Ron? Well, Ron and Jim, so, yes.
As far as the question is why we didn't vote on the survey.
Mhm.
I think in the admin
Mhm.
team is we didn't know what the answer was
Mhm.
going to be. So how could we vote on an answer that we didn't?
Which was one of the first questions right off the bat. How could we, right, exactly right.
Very expensive process too.
Yeah.
Pay $300,000 somewhere around that to get out.
Yep.
We're gonna possibly lose the building because we don't own this building. It belongs to.
Well, in that case, you wouldn't have lost the building, but there was money,
Right.
lots of that.
But if we split, who could maintain the building? Which group could maintain
Yep.
this church?
And it required,
All stay together.
it required a 60% vote. So, yeah, yeah. Kim?
I know everyone's saying, but why did, as far as I'm concerned, we had our fees, why did all these other churches vote to disaffiliate and they were able to do that? Now we're not. I understood that was not supposed to be taking place. So that's why I'm having trouble saying, well, how do we vote on something that hadn't happened?
Mhm.
The other churches did.
Mhm. Well, again, we chose not to. Is that fair to say? Yeah, we chose not to. Yep. Yeah, I hear that. I hear that. Yeah. I hear that. Yeah.
They were willing to risk it, could have gone either way for them.
Mhm.
They could have left the church, that's using each other by with their beliefs, so that just came down to what the congregation wanted, because from what I understand, what we thought.
It's hard. I've been hesitant to speak with other churches because I don't know. I can speculate in part. That's about the best I can do. But perhaps there are other churches who are very clear that they knew. But for churches that were this idea of a 60%, I think it was a 60 or 66%, it required a 60% vote. That was a whole nother thing to weigh. And so for some churches, they went forward with that. Yeah.
So, was it correct in the beginning you said that they could still somehow create a plan for us to have a true and just exit deposit they could throw out?
That is a Mike's saying no back there. That was brought forth at annual conference, but it is not something that's been done yet. Mike, were you going to speak to that as a trustee?
It's gonna have to pass through the legal body of the church.
Yep.
We've met as trustees about 6 times since general conference, because they wanted us to make the decision. We realized we couldn't make it,
Mhm.
because disaffiliation had been disbanded, gone away with,
Mhm.
gone away with. And we couldn't come up with a new procedure, because that was gonna violate the discipline.
Mhm.
So that's why it's with the bishop and the cabinet. But I think that before the bishop and cabinet can act, it's exactly what Craig said, the legal body of the church will have to make that decision. And since the discipline says there's no longer any disaffiliation or it's not mentioned, I don't know if they're gonna be able to get this close your church to go. That's just not.
Yep.
But Craig, on one other note, if I remember back on my administrative board day, anyone can attend the administrative board,
Mhm.
they just can't vote, correct?
Right. Right.
So if others want to come to the Tuesday meeting, whatever time that will be, it might be sent out in an email so that they can come and let
Mhm.
folks hear what they have to say. Because, there's a big difference from trustees voting whether we patch the roof or we repair the roof.
Yep.
Or we're going down this road.
Yep.
Or what, what's the whole church feel like? And we're not going to get everybody to agree. It's quite obvious.
Mhm.
We can't agree on anything in this country, So, but I just think that would be wise if you wanted to attend.
Yep.
Attend and give your thought.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Any other questions of that? Is there another? Kim, I don't think I answered. I'm going to swing back to you. Did I answer the best I could there? Okay. All right. Any other questions in terms of that? Okay. Just want to reiterate what Ron said. No decision been made. Working towards that, and we will include as best as possibly can to get voice from everyone as well. There's just a couple of things that came to me via the emails that folks asked me. One, there's always things that information that gets passed through is just not true, or it gets framed in a way that's not helpful. But I want to kind of address these as not dismissing them, but try to explain to you what I do know happened at General Conference. 3 of them are, there's been a lot of conversation about divesting, as you may have heard, and specifically divesting in Israel. Another one, a question I've been asked a few times is about, can we as clergy, is adultery no longer something we are not supposed to do? And the third one is, do we as a church invest in pro-life as a church? Those are 3 questions that came to me. I want to speak to the Israel one first. There were a few petitions, I think it was 5, forgive me if I had that wrong, that attempted to force divestment in companies that do business in Israel. In other words, as a Methodist church, we have finances, right? We have money. And that money gets invested just like our 401ks get invested. Well, money in Methodist Church gets invested. And so there were 5 petitions that if we had any monies in Israel businesses that we want to remove those, we want to divest from those companies. All of those petitions failed. If they had passed, we would have been forced to do that. And so no divestment was required after annual conference. There was a petition adopted that advocated for peaceful settlement of the conflict through negotiation and diplomacy rather than through methods of violence and coercion. That's almost, I think, taken right out of the social principles. That did pass a general conference, and a resolution was passed speaking against investing in Israeli bonds. And as I read that, I don't know how to tell you if that works necessarily. However, we were not forced to divest from Israeli businesses. As a Methodist church, we have folks who stand on all sides of how the Israeli conflict, Palestinian conflict should be resolved. That should be no surprise. That got voiced at General Conference. But those petitions did not pass. The resolution was speaking against them happening, but it has no bonding or binding power to it. I did go back and look. Note Westpath, our benefits body, has about 0.12% of its investment in Israel, Morocco, and Turkey combined. So in other words, there's very little money there, but there was no divesting that took place. Did we hear a political voice in that conversation? Absolutely. That was part of it as well. The second question I was asked a lot about is if the prohibition against adultery for clergy had been removed. That language did not make it into the next social principles. What it says now is that clergy ordinands must seek social responsibility and faithful sexual intimacy expressed through fidelity, monogamy, commitment, mutual affection and respect, careful and honest communication, mutual consent, and growth in grace and the knowledge and the love of God. That's a long way. It's different wording, but I hear in that I am expected to be celibate, monogamous, and faithful in my marriage. Did the language change? Yes. Did the restrictions change? In my opinion, absolutely not. It didn't change. We could debate that, I suppose, but I want to assure you, I feel quite sure that that's not something that was taken away for clergy, and Kim would have a lot to say about that as well. And then God. I was asked if United Methodist Church invests in pro-life organizations. This is kind of old news in some ways because it did before 2017. The UNMC did financially support Planned Parenthood, but in 2017 that was removed. We divested in 2017 to that. So that's the only thing I can say to that one in terms of we invest in pro-life initiatives. We don't invest in Black Lives Matters. There's a lot of organizations out there that are separate, have relationships in the church, but that we don't financially support. That was a question I received this week as well. I just wanted to touch on those three briefly because those are something I was asked a lot over the last few months. And I don't want to characterize where they come from, but just always check your sources. And if you ever have questions like that for me, let me see what your source was because that's important to me in answering those questions. But any questions in regards to those three things, or maybe other things that you've heard over the last few years, actually. Okay. It's a lot, right? And it's not perfect. It has been quite messy over the last few months and weeks and years. I share with you, it has been very difficult, not for me, but for all of us, to get through a season where we have deadlines for things that haven't happened yet. And how do we explain that? How do I explain that to you? It's hard. It's difficult. But I can promise you it's faithful. Your leadership is trying to be faithful in this. Perfect? No. Trying our best? Yes. But we will move forward from this. One of the things that I asked us to do in our last admin council was put a new team together that looks towards the future. We will make decisions. We will get through this in terms of the things we've talked about here. But it is time for me and all of us to also begin looking towards what's ministry in the future look like. How are we going to win souls to Christ? How are we going to transform the world? I'm not saying this stuff is a distraction. It's important. We must do it. But there's other parts of serving the kingdom and making the kingdom known in the world that I don't want us to ever get distracted with. I don't think we are, but I want us to keep us to task on that. So let's continue to hold those two things in tension. We will continue to communicate with you. I will send out a list of our leadership for those who've asked for that. And I know that out of Tuesday's meeting, there will be information to come to share with you all as well that will come from your admin chairs, trustees chairs as well over the next few weeks. So above all, pray for them. I'm praying for you. And we'll move forward together in a way that's kingdom-giving and life-giving as well. Yeah, one more question. Go ahead.
I just have one thought that it's kind of helped me through this process.
Mm-hmm.
Larry Snyder,
Mm-hmm.
wonderful, and presented the history of this church.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not our first rodeo.
No, it's happened a lot.
We have
Yeah.
split a lot.
Yeah.
And have split ideas. And the last thing, and if you'll recall, the last time we were in this room on Wednesday night, Lee Robertson spoke up and said, "What would Jesus say?"
Yeah.
So if you want the history of this church, we got through a bunch
And it is online for
We
us.
have split, and come back together.
Yeah.
You know, it's been a, if you've been a Methodist all your life, it's not our first rodeo.
Yeah. Yeah. And what a perfect person to give the last word to. Yeah. Just love. Keep loving. Thanks be to God. Go in peace, you all. Thank you.